A silver key glints in his hand as he tells me to relax, though his jaw is already tightening and the tension in the room stretches as thin as the cut of light slipping beneath the conference door, while I stand across from him, watching how that key tilts in his fingers, like it's waiting for him to decide what version of the truth he wants to lock away. He keeps his voice low, carefully modulated, but the stillness around him betrays the calm he's trying to project, and I feel myself narrowing in on the small cues, the twitch near his eye, the way his shoulders drop only when he thinks I'm not looking, the faint shift of his weight, as though preparing for impact. The polished table between us reflects his silhouette in a warping band, bending his frame into something slightly off-center, and I follow the distortion instinctively, letting my eyes track the curvature of the glass, because reflections have always revealed more than words ever do. He tells me again to relax softer this time, almost kindly, and for a moment I imagine someone else might believe him, someone who doesn't see how he already grips the key too tightly, the metal imprinting against his skin. I answer with nothing more than a measured breath, because silence often speaks more clearly than confrontation, and he hates when I withhold reaction. Even now his jaw works once before smoothing out again. He steps around the table, slow, deliberate, as though approaching a negotiation, instead of the endpoint of a long unraveling thread neither of us can pretend is whole anymore. His footsteps sound muted against the dark flooring, but I hear the strain beneath each measured step, the way he wants control and feels it slipping grain by grain. A ribbon of light cuts between us from the blinds, drawing a sharp line across his face that divides him into two expressions, the one he shows the world and the one he thinks he hides from me, and I let the silence stretch long enough for his discomfort to settle in. I focus on the silver key again, its edges catching every angled fragment of light, and I wonder which door he thinks it opens today, the one to justification, or the one he thinks he can still close behind me. When he finally speaks, the pitch of his voice softens, but something inside it strains a thread drawn too tight. He says we don't have to make this difficult, that everything is manageable, that I'm imagining tension where there is none, and I almost smile at the irony because the reflection on the table says otherwise warped and trembling from the barely perceptible shake in his hand. His calm breaks in tiny tremors he hopes I never notice, but I've learned to read the smallest fractures. The air between us feels suspended, waiting, and the room seems to tilt subtly as he sets the key on the glossy surface with exaggerated care, the metal tapping once, then rolling half an inch before settling. The sound lands like punctuation, soft but final. I stay still, anchored by the cold awareness threading through my ribs. He takes one more step toward me, looking for some sign that he still holds the upper hand, and when he doesn't find it, his expression hardens in the space between blinks. I keep my breathing steady, matching the rhythm of the quiet hum overhead, knowing this moment will shape everything that follows, not because of the key itself, but because of what he believes it represents: command, consequence, permission. He leans against the table now, close enough for the scent of his cologne to drift in the faintest trace, but far enough to maintain the illusion of civility. The blinds shift slightly as the building's ventilation murmurs through the room, scattering the light again, bending his shadow in a broken angle across the floor. He follows my gaze, sees the distortion, and subtly adjusts his stance, as though correcting the reflection might correct the reality beneath it. I don't move when he asks if we can have an honest conversation, because honesty has never been his language, and both of us know it. Instead, I let the moment breathe, let the silence draw sharper lines between truth and pretense. The key's thin shine becomes a fault line, marking where everything between us finally breaks open. He thinks this moment belongs to him, his office, his key, his version of calm. But he doesn't realize this is the last time he'll speak to me believing he has the advantage. The light shifts once more, slicing across my face, and I let it settle there before I lift my eyes fully to his steady and unblinking, because I want him to remember this exact second when the world begins turning away from him and toward what's coming. I hold that silence a beat longer, letting him feel it. Then I exhale just once, controlled, and watch something in him flicker with the first hint of fear, faint but unmistakable. He doesn't know yet, not really, but some part of him understands this is the beginning of his end, and I am done pretending otherwise. The moment freezes, the air sharpens, everything shifts. The past is already pulling me back. The reckoning starts here. Mini hook. The truth has already chosen its direction. I remembered the beginning long before the fracture showed, and before any signs of rupture emerged beneath the polished quiet of the office halls. I introduced myself the same way I had done for years. I'm Dana Mercer, 41, a forensic accountant from Seattle, Washington. The simplicity of that truth grounded me then, even while I sensed that something subtle had shifted in the air around Marcus in those early days, though I could not yet name it. I recalled wiping a fingerprint smudge from the glass wall beside my desk and watching how the light rippled across its surface. Object number 2, the glass reflection ripple, an illusion that made the straight lines bend as though the world wanted to warn me before the evidence ever could. I leaned closer, curious, and that was when I first noticed the motif seed forming in my mind. A faint reflection bends where the glass should be straight. The distortion unsettled me more than I allowed myself to admit, and when Marcus called me into his office soon after, I carried that small ripple in my mind like a quiet whisper of misalignment. He greeted me with an easy smile, too smooth, too measured, the kind he used in negotiations, where he already believed he held the upper hand, and I answered with my usual steady tone, telling myself not to overread the tension behind his eyes. He asked how my week had been, whether the audit forecasting model was close to done, and though I responded with calm professionalism, something in his posture felt off. His hands remained still on the table's edge, perfectly aligned, as if motion itself might betray him. There was a restraint in him that felt unnatural, attention pressed into silence before it could form words. I tried to ignore it, telling myself he was stressed from the upcoming board review, something we had endured together before, but the longer I sat across from him, the clearer the strain became. When he leaned back, the overhead lighting shifted, casting a thin beam that caught the glass wall behind him, bending the reflection again, mirroring the same ripple I'd seen earlier. I blinked, wondering if fatigue had softened the angle, but the distortion remained persistent enough to make my skin tighten. Marcus noticed my distraction and asked if something was wrong, and I told him no, because it was easier than explaining how a ripple in glass had unraveled a thread of unease inside me. He continued speaking about adjustments he wanted in the forecasting model, subtle changes that seemed unnecessary but not alarming enough to question outright. As he spoke, I studied the way his voice dipped lower than usual, how he used gentler phrasing, as though trying to cushion something unspoken. My instinct told me he was avoiding a subject, circling it without approaching, and when he finally dismissed me with a polite nod, the ripple in the glass wall flickered again in the corner of my eye. I closed the door behind me and paused in the hallway, letting the cool air settle around my thoughts. It wasn't fear. Fear had a sharper edge. It was a muted disquiet, something like a soft hinge creaking in the back of the mind. I told myself I was imagining the strain that Marcus's behavior had always fluctuated with external pressures, but the truth hovered there in the quiet. The distortions I kept seeing were not accidents. I felt the shift inside him before I ever saw proof, and the reflections recognized it before I did. I carried that thought with me through the rest of the day, noticing how even the smallest surfaces screened glare-polished floors, stainless elevator panels seemed to ripple at odd angles, tiny echoes of the warning I hadn't yet deciphered. The unease followed me to my car, into my living room that evening, and even into sleep, where light fractured in dreamlike patterns across imagined walls. When morning came, I told myself again that I was reading too much into shadows, that my mind was trained to find anomalies even where none existed. Still, when I stepped into the office and saw Marcus across the lobby greeting employees with that same measured charm, the ripple returned, faint but insistent. I watched him for a moment, long enough to see the subtle stiffness in his shoulders and the slight tightness around his eyes when he thought no one was looking. Something was wrong, Maybe small, maybe not, but something was wrong, and distortions rarely appeared without a source. Mini hook. The first fracture waited just out of sight. I returned to the office the next day, with the same practiced calm I always carried, though something in the air felt tighter, stretched thin around the edges of routine, as if the building itself anticipated what I hadn't yet uncovered. While sorting through documents for the quarterly readiness check, I noticed a torn envelope tucked beneath a stack of risk assessments, its rough edge catching slightly against the paper, as though insisting I notice it. Thomas's handwriting marked the front clean, precise strokes, but the tear was uneven, a hurried gesture that didn't match his usual discipline. I slid the envelope open, and a receipt fragment slipped into my palm, small enough to hide but heavy with implication. Its ink had bled faintly along one side, the kind that occurs when someone handles it with damp fingers. The restaurant name barely fit along the surviving edge, but the details printed beneath were unmistakable. Ref Z4 118, timestamp 11:42. I stared at the time first. Time. 11:42. Marcus had sworn yesterday that he'd been across town presenting a pitch at precisely 11. He'd corrected me when I'd guessed the hour, leaning on the firmness of his story with too much precision. My breath stilled as I traced the timestamp again. No, I murmured under my breath, that doesn't match. The light from my monitor reflected across the glossy table, bending around the receipt, just slightly causing a small ripple to distort the numbers for a moment before settling again. The distortion tugged at me, subtle but familiar enough to echo the earlier warnings I hadn't deciphered. I reached for my phone and called Thomas. He answered almost immediately, voice lower than usual. "You got it?" he asked. "I did," I said. "Where did this come from?" He hesitated, something shifting behind the quiet. "Cleaning crew," he finally said. "They found it near the executive elevator last night. Figured it might matter to you more than to anyone else." I leaned back in my chair. He said he was presenting to investors at that exact time. "This doesn't align. That's why I sent it," Thomas replied, tone tightening. "I didn't want to assume anything, but... well, you should see it for yourself." I thanked him, though the room felt colder as the call ended. I stared at the fragment, trying to conjure any benign explanation. A scheduling error. A duplicate receipt printed later, but the timestamp sat there resolute, unmoving, defying every angle from which I tried to interpret it. Some contradictions announce themselves quietly, but they break the world in unmistakable ways. I rose from my chair, gripping the receipt between two fingers, and made my way toward Marcus's office, steadying my breath with each step. The hallway was quiet, the low hum of lights blending with the muted rhythm of distant conversations. When I reached his door, he was already looking up as though he sensed I was coming. "Morning," he said, leaning back casually. "Everything good?" "I had a question," I replied, keeping my tone neutral. "About your meeting yesterday." He nodded once. "What about it?" "You mentioned it started at 11, I said, watching his face carefully, "and that you were there until almost 1. His jaw lifted slightly, not quite a clench, but close. "Correct. Why I opened my notebook, not enough to reveal everything, just enough to expose the faint corner of the receipt. "I came across something with a conflicting timestamp," I said. "A restaurant at 11:42. His eyes flicked toward the paper, then back to me, quick enough to suggest reflex rather than interest. "You're mixing things up," he said smoothly. "It's not unusual for timestamps to be off, especially when clients send things in bulk. Don't overthink a stray piece of paper." The casual dismissal hit harder than the contradiction itself. He wasn't surprised. He was irritated, annoyed that I'd brought it up at all. "I'm verifying accuracy," I said. "That's all." "Then verify it," he answered, waving a hand lightly. "And put it aside. We don't need distractions right now." I watched him another second, long enough to see the faint tension settle at the corner of his mouth, the way he avoided glancing at the receipt again, as though acknowledgement might give it weight. Then I stepped out of his office, closing the door quietly behind me. The hallway light caught the polished floor in a thin streak, bending my reflection into a softened, wavering outline. It didn't look like me. at least not the version of me he still believed he controlled. I returned to my desk, laid the receipt flat once more, and examined the timestamp. 11:42. If Marcus wasn't where he claimed to be, then whatever he was doing mattered. And if Thomas felt the need to send this to me anonymously, then someone else had noticed the cracks too. Truth rarely shouts when it first arrives. It slips in through the smallest tears and waits to be seen. I tucked the fragment back into my notebook, aware now that this was more than a minor inconsistency. It was the first fracture, the one that warns the entire structure is not what it seems. Mini hook. The deeper misalignment hid in the next discovery. The auditorium buzzed with low conversation as employees filtered into the quarterly briefing, the air charged with that peculiar blend of anticipation and boredom that always accompanied corporate gatherings. But I sensed a sharper undercurrent threading through the room, something I couldn't place yet. The overhead lighting hummed faintly, and one bulb above the projection screen flickered in irregular pulses, casting thin, trembling shadows across the polished floor. That stuttering light, unstable and insistent, kept pulling my attention even as people greeted one another, shaking hands, exchanging pleasantries. I took a seat near the aisle close enough to see the stage, but far enough back to remain unnoticed. Marcus stood near the front, his posture carefully relaxed, performing confidence for the audience. Lexi hovered near him, her expression too composed, her smile a little too tight, as if she held a secret beneath her tongue. I watched her angle her phone toward Marcus, whisper something, and then glance around the room. The flickering bulb above them sputtered again briefly, illuminating her face in a harsh white flash that made her flinch. When the briefing began, the large screen behind Marcus lit up with the company logo, and he launched into his practiced introduction voice, smooth enough to glide over any minor distractions. But the flickering bulb worsened, stuttering in rapid intervals, causing rippled shadows to slide across his suit in oddly fractured patterns. People shifted uncomfortably, some glancing up, some murmuring under their breath. Marcus ignored it, pushing forward with his speech about performance milestones, restructuring strategies, and projected growth. Then a brief digital chirp cut through the room, sharp, unexpected, impossible to ignore. The screen behind him blinked. A new window popped open. For a split second, the image was too blurred to recognize, but then the subject line snapped into focus. RE replacement transition, draft time-stamped 0917. A collective inhale rippled through the audience. Someone whispered, "What is that?" Another person lifted their phone to record. Marcus froze mid-sentence, the flickering bulb above him seizing in a final shudder, before dimming back to life, its light now exposing the tension locking his shoulders. The email fragment expanded automatically, projected at full brightness for the entire auditorium to see. I heard Lexi gasp, a soft, almost strangled sound. She lunged toward this tech table, but two analysts were already staring wide-eyed at the screen hands hovering uselessly over their keyboards. Marcus stepped back, color draining from his face. The email preview revealed enough a draft outlining a transition plan for my position, discussed long before any conflict or justification existed. The timestamp, 0917, contradicted every assurance he'd given about valuing my role, our collaboration, our history. "This isn't supposed to be up there," Marcus snapped, but his voice cracked around the edges, the strain painfully evident. A few employees exchanged glances, some whispering my name. A camera near the back swiveled subtly. Phones rose. Screens brightened. Someone muttered, "Did they really plan to replace her?" And a moment later, louder, "Why hide it?" Marcus stammered something about an internal draft, about private discussions, about miscommunication. But the words flailed uselessly in the air between him and the watching crowd. Lexi stepped forward, her voice trembling. "It was forwarded automatically," she said. I didn't mean—" She cut off as Marcus shot her a sharp look, but the damage was already complete, echoing through the audience like an unspoken verdict. The room watched him unravel under the weight of his own deception, and the light above made every fracture impossible to hide. I kept my eyes on the screen, letting the truth settle into its rightful place. The document was incomplete, but it was enough to show betrayal enough to expose intent enough to shift the balance of silence. I rose slowly from my seat, though I didn't speak. I didn't need to. The humiliated tension swirling around Marcus spoke louder than anything I could have said. He tried to regain control, gesturing sharply to kill the projection. His voice barked orders to the tech staff, but their hands shook their attempts, fumbling. The flickering bulb hissed lightly an electrical catch before returning to its erratic pulse, slicing his figure into alternating bands of light and dark. Someone near me whispered, "Is that real?" Someone else answered, "It's her email thread, it has to be." Marcus forced a smile, brittle and collapsing at the edges. "Let's refocus," he said. "This is simply a misunderstanding." I watched the crowd shift again, watched people trade looks that said they didn't believe him anymore, even those who once admired him. In that moment, beneath the quivering light, he looked smaller, like the distortion of his reflection, finally matched the shape beneath the surface. The truth wasn't loud, but its arrival tore through the silence with surgical precision. When the screen finally went black, the damage was irreversible. Marcus cleared his throat, straightened his suit, and tried to continue the briefing, but the words clung to him like wet fabric, heavy, uncomfortable, impossible to carry. I stayed quiet, absorbing every detail, the whispers, the glances, the shifting loyalties forming in real time. The first public crack had opened, and everyone had witnessed it. The flickering bulb trembled again, casting an uneven glow across the aisle as I stepped out of the row, letting the moment breathe as I walked toward the exit. Mini hook. The deeper betrayal waited where no one was watching. I returned to my office after the disastrous briefing, feeling the weight of 100 stolen glances lingering on my skin, each one silently repeating what the room had already decided: Marcus was hiding something. And the leak hadn't been a glitch, it was a revelation. I closed the door behind me and let the quiet settle, the kind of quiet that sharpened thought instead of softening it. The afternoon light skimmed across my desk, catching the edge of a metal lamp and casting a long metallic shadow over the financial reports I'd pulled earlier, stretching across the papers like a dark underline demanding attention. I sat down, inhaled slowly, and pulled up the account logs I'd been reviewing before the briefing. The numbers waited on the screen, orderly and obedient, yet wrong in a way that bothered me more than I wanted to admit. I traced the first code with my cursor, ACT, Mauschert 77, LA9, then compared it to the mirrored version, ACT, Auer 77, LB9. They differed by a single letter, but the implications ran deeper than any single character should. "That shouldn't exist," I whispered to myself. "You don't duplicate a dormant account with a shadow variation unless you're hiding activity." The metallic shadow on the desk shifted as I leaned in, making the surface of the documents appear uneven. My pulse tightened. I cross-referenced the codes again. 77 LA9 was the original structure I had helped design years ago, an architecture stable enough to support most of Marcus's expansion, but quiet enough to disappear beneath more prominent assets. But number 77 LB9 was newer, modified recently, and according to the timestamp logs, altered without any legitimate request or approval. I reached for my notebook and flipped back to earlier entries. "He said the restructuring was routine," I muttered, scanning my notes. "Routine doesn't create a second account with a nearly identical signature." The realization began to take shape inside me, steady and cold. This wasn't administrative oversight. It wasn't a clerical error. Someone had copied the framework of my original account structure, adjusted its routing, and assigned it new dependencies. The only person with enough access and motive was Marcus. He hadn't just planned to replace me. He'd begun rewriting the foundation beneath my work, to erase my part in it entirely. The thought made my chest tighten, and I pushed back from the desk, walking to the window to steady my breath. Outside, the city moved with its usual indifference, cars weaving through traffic, pedestrians wrapped in their own urgency, but inside the office the air felt dense, expectant. When I returned to my desk, I began pulling every file tied to the duplicated account, searching for discrepancies. I found them quickly. Routing instructions altered, approval signatures missing, transfer logs masked in irregular intervals. "This is deliberate," I whispered. "It has to be." I picked up my phone and called the only person who might confirm my suspicion without alerting Marcus. "Thomas," I said. When he answered, "I need you to check 2 accounts for me." Quietly. He hesitated. "Is this connected to what happened this morning?" "Just look at the codes," I said, keeping my voice low. 77 LA9 and 77 LB9. Tell me if you see what I see. Papers rustled on his end, followed by silence. "Then LB9 shouldn't be here," he said, voice dropping. "It's a clone. Someone duplicated the architecture." "Someone with access," I said. "Yes," he replied, "and someone trying very hard to bury the connection." The confirmation landed with a cold finality. I thanked him, but he added quietly, "Dana, be careful where this leads." When I hung up, I stared at the metallic shadow again, the dark blade stretching across the desk, as if pointing directly at the truth I was now forced to confront. My mind churned through everything I knew about Marcus's behavior, the smooth reassurances, the dismissals, the tightening jaw whenever I asked too pointed a question. He had been preparing for this, not because I was failing, but because my work had become too foundational for him to control openly. I realized Marcus wasn't trying to replace me. He was trying to claim every structure I had built as his own. I sat down again, pulling the files closer. If he was rewriting my systems behind my back, then whatever he planned next would be even larger, possibly catastrophic. My hands steadied as I logged into the archive directory, searching deeper. I found transfer activity routed through LB9 that bypassed standard authorization, small amounts accumulating in intervals that suggested testing, probing the system for weakness or opportunity. I felt the familiar tightening behind my eyes, the one that always struck when a puzzle shifted from confusing to solvable. He wasn't improvising. He was executing a sequence. And the leaked email earlier wasn't a standalone humiliation. It was the first sign that multiple layers of deception were already in motion. The shadow on my desk deepened as the sun shifted, sharpening its edge into a clean, dark line that pointed toward the next folder I hadn't yet opened. I reached for it, feeling the weight of what I already knew forming inside me like a quiet verdict. Marcus wasn't losing control. He had begun pulling strings long before anyone noticed, and I had just found the first one still attached to my name. Mini Hook. The next string waited in the dark corridors of the archive. I stayed late that night, long after most of the office had emptied, letting the silence settle around me as I traced the discrepancies through every corridor of the digital archive, each inconsistency tightening the coil inside my chest. The glow of my monitor cast a thin silver band across my desk, but the logs I needed weren't accessible from my station. They were stored in a locked records room at the far end of the administrative wing, a place only a few people had reason to enter. I gathered my notes and walked the dim hallway. The building hum softened to a low pulse as the motion lights flickered awake in small sections. When I reached the archive door, I hesitated, staring at the cold doorknob, catching a weak sliver of light from the emergency fixture overhead. The metal felt icy beneath my hand, a temperature that didn't match the room around it, and as I turned it, the light shifted across its curved surface. The reflection split into 2 uneven lines. The reflection splits again, sharper this time. The words formed in my mind with a clarity that startled me. Inside the archive room smelled faintly of paper dust and old wiring, and rows of steel shelves framed the narrow pathway leading to the single terminal connected to restricted logs. I pulled up the access records, fingers steady, despite the rising tension in my throat. The entries scrolled past in neat chronological order, employee check-ins, maintenance overrides, routine scans, until one timestamp embedded itself in my vision. 0103. I clicked on it, watching the screen widen to reveal the full record. Marcus's ID, a late-night entry. Log reference BL021. I leaned back, pulse hammering once against my ribs. "That's impossible," I whispered. "He said he wasn't here." I checked the date twice, then a third time, and each verification only deepened the cold certainty spreading through me. He had insisted he'd been with investors that night, repeating it with that smooth confidence he always used to reinforce lies he hoped would become truth. But the log contradicted him clean and absolute. An after-hours entry at 0103 meant he had deliberately accessed this room, the one containing the original architecture and audit trails, linking back to the structures he was now trying to rewrite. I exhaled slowly, trying to process the magnitude of it. "What were you doing in here, Marcus?" The hum of the building seemed to thicken, filling my ears with an uneasy vibration. I checked the log details again and noticed the duration. 11 minutes. Enough time to pull files. Enough time to alter something. Enough time to bury something deeper. A faint chill moved across the room. I turned sharply, half expecting someone to be standing in the doorway, but the hall beyond remained empty, lit only by the soft glow of an exit sign. Still, I couldn't shake the sensation of being watched. The truth hid behind his precision, each lie stitched carefully to the next to form a seamless disguise. I returned to the terminal, scrolling through file access patterns surrounding the 01 or 03 entry. Several directories had been opened: financial frameworks, compliance risk maps, dormant account assets, and one particular folder caught my attention, the legacy structure I had designed years earlier. My chest tightened. He had accessed the heart of the system, the part he couldn't replicate without me. I clicked deeper, following the trail through altered metadata, noting the timestamps that mirrored his entry. But something else stood out: a deletion marker. He hadn't just accessed the structure, he had removed something. A log, a note, a line of code that once documented why the system depended on its original architecture. "You wanted to erase my imprint," I said quietly. "You wanted the system without the origin." I saved screenshots to my encrypted drive, knowing full well Marcus would never imagine I had access to this terminal at this hour. Still, a cold prickle ran down my spine. I shut down the screen and stepped back into the hallway. The lights overhead flickered, and I glanced toward the elevator, convinced I heard a soft click echoing from down the corridor. I waited. Nothing. Just silence stretching too long to feel innocent. I steadied my breath and walked quickly, my shoes striking the floor in a controlled rhythm. When I reached my office, the metallic shadow from earlier had vanished, replaced by a stillness that made the room feel abruptly foreign. I closed the door behind me and leaned against it, letting the truth settle. Marcus had been rewriting my work in the daylight and erasing it in the dark. The 0103 entry wasn't a mistake. It was the moment he crossed into territory he couldn't step back from. The access log wasn't just evidence of deceit. It was proof he feared the one thing he couldn't control: the truth embedded in my work. I sat down and opened my laptop again, fingers trembling only slightly as I documented every step, every timestamp, every altered file directory. This wasn't just about being replaced anymore. It was about the architecture of the entire company shifting beneath a lie he'd engineered. I shut the laptop finally, the weight of the revelation settling across my shoulders like a cold cloak. I had crossed a threshold too, and whatever came next would not stay in the shadows. Mini hook. The next proof weighted with sharper edges than this one. Janelle called me into a small conference room the next morning, her tone clipped and professional, the kind that suggested she'd already formed conclusions she wasn't yet ready to reveal. The blinds were half drawn, letting in a thin strip of daylight that carved the room into sharp angles. As I stepped inside, I noticed a faint drift of cigarette ash on the floor near the doorway, a delicate gray flake falling from the cuff of someone's jacket as they exited moments before. It curled downward with a slow, fragile motion, landing softly on the carpet like a quiet omen. Janelle gestured for me to sit, her posture precise, her blazer forming clean lines against the back of her chair. "We need to talk," she said, folding her hands, "and I'm going to ask you to be completely direct with me." I kept my expression steady. "About what?" She tapped a tablet on the table, activating the screen. "About this." A still frame opened, grainy but unmistakable. Frame 442A. The timestamp matched the night I'd found Marcus's 0103 access log. The image showed him stepping out of the building's lower exit, his coat pulled tight, a set of sealed documents clutched under his arm. My breath tightened. "Where did you get this?" I asked. "Compliance review," she said. "We're running a deeper audit now. Someone flagged unusual access activity last night. I thought you might know something about that." Her eyes held mine steadily intelligent and discerning. "You were working late," she added. "Yes," I said. "I was." "Then you already know this isn't normal." She turned the tablet toward me again, zooming in on Marcus's hand gripping the documents. Even with the grainy footage, the shape was clear, folders pulled from a restricted section, likely holding the very materials he'd tried to erase. I swallowed. "What exactly are you asking?" "I'm asking whether your work is involved," she said, her voice lowering, "and whether he's been using your systems for something he shouldn't." I hesitated, weighing the risk of speaking too openly. "I found discrepancies," I said finally, "but I'm still tracing them." "He accessed records at 1 a.m, she replied. "That alone demands scrutiny." She paused. "And you were the architect of several frameworks he relies on. If those were altered, I need to know." Her words pressed against the truth I'd been holding, making it impossible to keep hiding behind caution. I leaned forward slightly. "There are duplicated accounts, shadow versions. One of them ties directly to a structure I built, and the logs from last night link him to the folders where the changes were made." Janelle absorbed this silently, her expression tightening just enough to confirm she had suspected something similar. "So he's covering tracks," she said. "And he's doing it sloppily." I shook my head. "Not sloppily, just urgently." The strip of daylight across the table caught the corner of the tablet screen, distorting Marcus's figure in the still frame, stretching his shadowed outline into a warped, elongated shape. I hated how fitting it looked. "This aligns with other anomalies," she continued tapping the screen. "We found gaps in the compliance audit, missing signatures, altered timestamps. His division controls too many moving parts for it to be coincidence." She leaned back, studying me carefully. "I need to know if you're willing to cooperate formally." The word formally echoed with its own weight. It meant stepping into the open, becoming part of the investigation, letting my connection to the original financial architecture come fully into view. It meant Marcus would realize exactly how much I knew and how close I was to unraveling him. If I say yes, I asked what happens next. "Then we start pulling the threads he can't hide," she said. "And we do it fast." Her confidence should have comforted me, but instead it pressed a cold clarity into my chest. She slid the tablet closer, zooming in further on frame number 442A until the sealed documents were centered. "Do you recognize these?" she asked. I did. Even blurred, the outer folder had a faint diagonal crease across its spine, the same crease worn into one of the legacy files I'd reviewed dozens of times years ago, the one that proved the dependency chain he was trying so hard to erase. "Yes," I said quietly, "I recognize them." She nodded once. "Then we have what we need to escalate." The still frame felt like a pivot, the moment where suspicion hardened into undeniable fact. I noticed the gray flake of cigarette ash again near the doorway, its delicate presence stark against the dark carpet, and for a moment I wondered who had been standing there earlier, listening, calculating. Because nothing about this investigation felt isolated anymore. Eyes were opening across the building, whispers forming in corners, loyalties, shifting. Janelle rose from her chair. "I'll be in touch soon," she said. "Be ready. This is about to move quickly." I stood feeling the gravity of her words settle over me like a colder, heavier layer of air. As I stepped into the hallway, the echo of her warning lingered in my mind. Marcus wasn't just hiding wrongdoing, he was dismantling the path behind him. And now, the investigation had him framed in more ways than one. Mini hook. The next uncovering would cut closer than he expected. Janelle summoned me again in the late afternoon this time to a dim auxiliary meeting room tucked behind the compliance wing, a place usually reserved for quiet disputes or uncomfortable clarifications. The overhead lights weren't fully functioning, leaving only a small desk lamp, casting a fractured glow across the table where a decorative frame had broken earlier in the day. Its shattered glass swept mostly aside, except for one slender shard that remained catching the lamp's beam in an angled glint that flickered whenever someone stepped near it. I took a seat across from her, noticing how the shard threw a sliver of distorted light across a stack of documents between us. She folded her arms slowly, signaling this wasn't a routine conversation. "I need your eyes on something," she said. We pulled the regulatory audits tied to the divisions Marcus oversees. She slid 2 printed reports across the table. "Take a look at the references here." I leaned forward, scanning the first page. Audit CX-14. Everything aligned, signatures, timestamps, the usual formatting. Then I picked up the second. Audit CX-22. My pulse tightened. "This can't be right," I said quietly. "These aren't the same structure." "Exactly," Janelle replied. "The numbers don't line up. CX-14 shows a stable pattern consistent with your original architecture. CX-22 shows a rerouted chain, as if someone tried to rebuild your framework without following your logic." I flipped between the pages, the discrepancy glaring once it snapped into focus. CX-14 held clean routing. CX-22 showed deviations that shouldn't exist, subtle enough to evade casual review, but egregious under forensic scrutiny. "He recreated parts of it," I murmured, "but he didn't understand the dependencies." Janelle's expression hardened. "That's not the worst part. Look at the audit signatures." They differed. Slightly but undeniably. Someone had overwritten the verification field on CX-22, replacing the original with a falsified marker, and the date printed beside it matched the night Marcus accessed the restricted logs at 01:03. My stomach dropped. "He altered the audit," I whispered, "or had someone do it." The mirror shard on the table caught the light again, scattering a fractured beam across the mismatched documents, the distorted reflection amplifying the unease already unraveling across my thoughts. It hit me then how deeply the deception ran, how he had threaded lies through every layer of oversight until they resembled truth. I pushed the papers toward her. "This isn't just misconduct," I said. "It's structural tampering. If CX-22 was used in any official report—" "It was," she said. "That's why this is so serious." The room felt colder, or maybe that was the consequence of hearing exactly what I'd feared. She took a slow breath, folding her hands on the table. "I need you to help me interpret which parts belong to your original design. If we can prove CX-22 diverges in ways that compromise compliance, it becomes undeniable evidence of manipulation." The weight of her request settled heavily on my shoulders. "You're asking me to confirm that he corrupted the architecture." "Yes," she said, voice firm, "because you're the only one who understands the difference well enough for this to hold up legally." I traced the rerouted lines on CX-22 again, following their broken pathways, until they circled back into contradictions. If Marcus had understood the system better, he might have hidden the evidence more effectively. But he was arrogant. He thought imitation was enough. He tried to erase me from the foundation, I said, a bitterness threading through my voice. But he didn't realize the imprint can't be removed without destabilizing everything tied to it. Janelle nodded. "Which means the collapse is already in motion." Something inside me shifted then, not fear, but a deeper recognition that the truth I'd been assembling was bigger than personal betrayal. I looked at her. "How far does the impact reach?" She hesitated before replying. "Farther than you want to hear. These audits feed into investor reports, regulatory filings, risk assessments. If they're compromised, the backlash is catastrophic." My breath caught the implications, forming a darker pattern than any reflection I'd seen so far. So he wasn't just erasing my work, I said. He was reshaping the company's foundation while it was in motion. "And now it's unstable," she confirmed, "which is why we move quickly." She gathered the reports, aligning them neatly, though, The mirror shard on the table threw a jagged line of light across the surfaces, warping the edges. I found myself staring at that glint, the way it made the document seem torn between truth and deception. She noticed my focus and lowered her voice. "We're going to need you at the next review meeting. Once these findings surface, there's no containing the fallout." I nodded slowly, feeling the weight of the moment deepen. Everything I once believed about Marcus, the careful confidence, the polished leadership, the calculated charm, fractured beneath the evidence now in front of me. He wasn't just unethical, he was reckless. And he had gambled everything on the assumption that no one would dig deep enough to see the seams splitting underneath. Janelle closed her folder. "I'll coordinate with legal," she said. "You prepare your notes. This is about to escalate." I stood feeling the shift inside my chest settle into something harder, clearer. The mirrored shard glinted one last time as I stepped away, its fractured beam sliding across the mismatched audits like a warning made of light. Mini hook. And the next truth would expose what he feared most. I spent the evening sorting through the folder Janelle had given me, spreading the documents across my desk, like a fragmented map of someone else's secrets, though each fractured piece led back to systems I had once built with quiet pride. The office was nearly silent, the kind of stillness that made every small sound feel larger, the hum of the lamp, the soft shift of paper beneath my hands. As I reached for another report, the edge of one sheet slid unexpectedly against my finger, leaving a thin, sharp sting. I pulled my hand back, watching a single line of red rise along the cut, the pain slight but precise like a warning delivered through touch alone. I pressed the fingertip against a tissue and continued sorting, letting the cold clarity of the work drown out the ache beneath my skin. In the center of the pile lay a slim envelope I hadn't noticed before. The corner bore the compliance seal, but the flap had been opened hastily, the crease uneven. I pulled out the document inside a memo marked D31. My breath paused. "This isn't part of the audit set," I whispered. I scanned the first lines and felt the room tilt as the implications unfolded. The memo detailed dependency sequences throughout the company's financial infrastructure, referencing the original architecture I had created years ago, the one Marcus had supposedly modernized. But according to D31, his entire expansion model still relied on my original framework. Every update he claimed as his own was merely a thin layer built on foundations he neither credited nor fully understood. Worse, any attempt to replace me would destabilize his system without immediate intervention. I stared at the memo pulse tightening. "So, you needed me all along," I murmured. "You just couldn't let anyone see it." I traced the signatures at the bottom compliance cross-check legal review. Strategic implications, each line confirming the same truth. Marcus's rise depended entirely on work he had tried to erase. I heard myself whisper, "He can't function without the structure I built." The words felt heavier than the room could hold. The door opened slightly, and I looked up to see Janelle standing there, her expression tense. "You found it," she said. I nodded. "Why didn't you tell me this was in the stack?" "Because I needed to know how you'd interpret it on your own," she replied, closing the door behind her. D31 was buried. Someone didn't want it circulating internally. She moved closer, her voice lowering. "This proves his dependency. It shows he never replaced your architecture, just hid the parts that tied back to you." The truth sharpened inside me, slicing through whatever doubt I had left like the edge of that paper. I handed her the memo. "This means every claim he made about restructuring was false." "Not entirely false," she said, "just incomplete. He changed what he could without breaking the system, but your original logic still holds the core together." I leaned against the desk, allowing the weight of her words to settle. "Then why plan to replace me?" "Because acknowledging your central role weakens his authority," she answered. "And men who build their power on illusion don't tolerate architects they can't overshadow." She paused, studying my face. "This memo can expose every discrepancy, but it also puts you in danger of becoming the central figure in this investigation." "I already am," I said, "whether I asked for it or not." She nodded grimly. "Tomorrow's review meeting is going to open doors that can't be closed again. D31 will force internal oversight to launch a full inquiry. Be ready, he'll know exactly where the blow came from. I returned to the documents on my desk, scanning the branching diagrams traced through D31. Every thread, every dependency, every logic loop, my work, my design had been the invisible skeleton supporting his empire. He had taken credit for the growth, yet left the structure intact beneath his name, hoping no one would ever see the truth buried in the original blueprint. The sting on my finger pulsed again, small but insistent, grounding me in the moment. I pressed the tissue against it, staring at the memo, until the lines seemed to blur. The realization trembled through me. He didn't just fear exposure, he feared that without my work, the entire facade of his leadership would collapse. I gathered the papers into a neat stack, sliding D31 to the top. He built everything on a lie, I said quietly, and tomorrow, that lie becomes visible. Janelle gave a slow nod. Get some rest if you can. You'll need clarity for what comes next. She left the room, closing the door gently behind her. I stood alone in the fading light of the lamp, the shadows lengthening across my desk, as if marking the countdown to the moment the truth would break open. I slipped D31 into my folder, the cut on my finger throbbing with a steady reminder the smallest fracture can bleed into the deepest fault line. Mini hook. And the fault line was ready to split wide open. The review meeting convened in the executive boardroom the next morning, its sweeping glass walls reflecting a tension that seemed to cling to everyone who entered. The long, polished table gleamed beneath recessed lights, and at each seat rested a water glass filled halfway, the surface trembling whenever a chair shifted or someone exhaled too sharply. I took my place near the center, positioned between Janelle and two board members, whose eyes darted toward me with a mixture of curiosity and unease, as if they sensed the quiet fracture already threading through the day. Marcus stood at the far end, back straight, hands clasped behind him, performing authority, with a precision that had always served him until now. The room settled into a thick, expectant hush as the screens on the wall flickered awake. Janelle slid a folder toward me. "Stay close to the details," she whispered. "Today hinges on clarity." Marcus cleared his throat. "Before we begin," he said, "I want to acknowledge yesterday's technical error. The leaked email was taken out of context." His voice carried just enough confidence to sound deliberate, but his hand brushed the water glass in front of him, and the surface shivered tiny ripples, breaking its stillness. "We've had compliance anomalies," he continued, "but I assure you all of them have reasonable explanations." Janelle rose before he could continue tapping a remote. "Let's test that assertion." The screen shifted to a projected ledger screenshot, each line of text sharp and damning. Across the top appeared its identifier, Master Roll 77B. The room stilled instantly. Someone leaned forward. Someone else muttered, "That's not the standard roll." Marcus froze. "Where did you get that?" Janelle ignored him. "This ledger records a series of unauthorized transfers that bypassed both compliance and internal oversight." She pointed to a highlighted chain of entries. "These transfers are routed through dependency structures tied to the original framework designed years ago, the one Dana built." Every eye turned toward me. I kept my expression steady. The water glass nearest me trembled again, casting a wavering reflection onto the table. "I never approved those routes," I said firmly, "and no legitimate update would have altered them without my review." Marcus's jaw tightened. "She's misinterpreting the data," he snapped. "That's a test environment, not a real ledger." Janelle tapped the screen again, enlarging a time-stamped approval line associated with a user ID. "Then explain why your authorization appears here," she said. "These routes originated from your account, and the dependencies point directly to structures Dana created." A board member turned sharply toward Marcus. "You said those frameworks were replaced." "They were," he insisted. "Her system was outdated." If it was outdated, Janelle cut in, "Why does Master Roll 77B rely on her architecture to function?" The question struck the room like a clean blade slicing through any illusion he still carried. Marcus opened his mouth, then closed it again. He reached for his water glass, but his hand shook enough to make the surface ripple violently. Someone whispered, "This can't be a misunderstanding. The routing signatures are explicit." Another voice added, If he used outdated architecture for active transfers, that's a compliance violation. Janelle stepped closer to the screen. The transfers were disguised under mirrored account structures, resembling the ones Dana originally built. Without her architecture, these entries collapse. The logical pathways don't exist without her work. She turned to me. Can you confirm I nodded, my breath steady? The blueprint beneath those transfers is mine. I can verify every dependency. Marcus slammed his hand against the table. She's doing this to undermine me, he shouted, the sudden outburst echoing against the glass walls. A few board members recoiled. Others stared in stunned disbelief. Dana resented being replaced, and now she's manufacturing a narrative. Nobody manufactured your authorization signature, Janelle said, and nobody forced you into the archive at 0103. His face drained of color, the words hitting him with the precision of a verdict. He looked around the room, searching for someone, anyone to support him, but the weight of the evidence hung visibly in the air, impossible to deny. The trembling water glass tipped slightly as he brushed it again, sending a thin stream of water spilling across the polished surface. He didn't notice, or couldn't. You don't understand, he said, voice cracking. Everything needed to move quickly. The investors demanded results. I had to restructure. Restructuring isn't the issue, Janelle replied. Deception is. And suddenly the entire room understood exactly how long he had been lying and how many layers he had buried the truth beneath. A board member leaned forward. Marcus, he said slowly, did you knowingly hide these transfers? Marcus's breath faltered. I optimized the process. I didn't hide anything. But the words landed weakly, too thin to cover the empty space where the truth had already taken root. He sank into his chair, shoulders collapsing inward, his authority evaporating under the stark, projected ledger that held his downfall. Janelle powered down the screen. The silence that followed carried a different weight, now not anticipation, but recognition. A shift in the room's center of gravity, a break that would not mend. I gathered my folders slowly, watching the water glass settle into stillness at last. His hands trembled instead. Money hook. And the next step would decide who walked away intact. After the meeting, the office felt unnaturally quiet, as though the building were holding its breath to see what would happen next. I walked back to my desk with the folder pressed against my side, each step echoing with the memory of the ledger projection of Marcus's voice cracking beneath the weight of his own unraveling. When I reached my chair, I found a pen lying across the edge of my notebook, one I didn't remember leaving there. Its barrel was snapped cleanly in the middle, the broken halves angled sharply like a fault line that had finally given way. I picked it up slowly, running my thumb across the jagged edge. The break wasn't accidental. It was deliberate, the kind of damage made by someone exerting too much pressure in too little time. The ink had leaked slightly, leaving a small dark stain on the page beneath it. I sat down, letting the silence settle around me. Moments later, the soft knock on my door made me look up. Marcus stood there, paler than I had ever seen him, his shoulders slightly bowed, the polished confidence stripped away. "Dana," he said quietly. "Do you have a moment?" I considered denying him, but gestured for him to come in. He closed the door behind him, though his hand trembled slightly on the handle. "They're moving quickly," he said. "Janelle, the board, they're treating me like a criminal." "You forged approvals," I replied. "You bypassed oversight. You built your reputation on systems you didn't understand." He winced as though the truth hurt more than any accusation. "I didn't plan for it to go this far," he said. I needed to keep control. Things were slipping. Investors were pushing for growth. I couldn't deliver without shortcuts. "So you used my work," I said, "and tried to erase the parts that exposed you." He exhaled, sinking into the chair opposite mine. "You're right. I did rely on you more than I ever admitted. You saw the patterns I couldn't. You built structures I tried to claim because admitting I needed you felt like admitting weakness." His voice faltered. I know how that sounds. I folded my hands, the broken pen lying between us, like an artifact of everything he had shattered. Do you really? I asked softly. Because this isn't about weakness. It's about integrity. He looked at the pen, eyes tightening. I broke that earlier, he said. Didn't even mean to leave it here. I just snapped. His voice carried a tremor I had never heard before, fear, not performance. For the first time, he looked like a man confronting the exact size of the damage he had done. He leaned forward. Is there any way to stop this, to soften it? I met his eyes steadily. You're asking the wrong person. He swallowed. I know. I just thought maybe. His words drifted into silence. The light from the hallway slipped through the glass panel beside my door, casting a warped reflection onto the surface of my desk, bending around the broken pen. The ink stain, the stack of papers that had carried his downfall. And then as the angle shifted slightly, the distortion cleared, straightening into a defined line. The reflection finally aligns, showing what was there all along. Marcus followed my gaze, and something in his expression collapsed, not in anger, but in understanding. You always saw clearer than I did, he said. I should have listened. I should have. It's too late for that, I replied, though not unkindly. The truth is out. He nodded a slow, resigned motion. They'll end my career, he said. This will follow me forever. Actions do, I answered. Consequences do. He stared at the floor, absorbing the inevitability. After a long moment, he stood. I'm sorry, Dana, he said quietly. Not that it matters now, but I am. The sincerity in his voice surprised me, not enough to change anything, but enough to shift the air between us. He placed a hand on the back of the chair, steadying himself. This is the part where everything stops, he murmured. Or where everything starts again, I said, but that's not up to you anymore. He gave a faint, broken nod and turned toward the door. As he stepped into the hallway, the fractured reflection on the glass recomposed itself into a shape I finally recognized, not his power, not his authority, but the truth behind both a man built on borrowed structures facing a reality he could no longer outrun. I looked down at the broken pen and touched the dried ink at its edge. The damage was done, and the next part of this story had already begun moving without him. Mini Hook. The final reckoning waited just one step ahead. The building feels different this morning, as if the air has settled into a quieter honesty after weeks of strained illusions. I walk through the lobby with a calm I haven't felt in a long time, the kind that comes only when the truth has finished reshaping everything it touches. Security nods as I pass, a gesture weighted not with routine, but with recognition. Everyone knows what happened now. Marcus resigned late last night. The email went out just before dawn. No explanations, no denials, just a brief acknowledgement that he was stepping down effective immediately. Now the company feels suspended in a hush, waiting to see what fills the space he left behind. I step into the elevator and press the top floor button, feeling the soft vibration of the machinery hum beneath my feet. When the doors begin to close, the polished metal reflects my silhouette, steady, centered, uncompressed by shadows that once distorted the edges. I let the moment breathe. The doors slide shut, and I rise through the building I helped shape in ways no one fully understood until now. When I reach the executive floor, Janelle is waiting near the conference room, her expression composed but softened by something like relief. We finalize the report, she says. The board accepted all findings. They know what you uncovered. I nod carefully. What happens next? They want you to take interim oversight of the restructuring, she replies. Your architecture is the backbone of the company. They finally recognize that. I exhale slowly. It's strange, I say. Having the truth land all at once. Janelle smiles faintly. Truth has its own timing. You didn't force it. You followed the evidence. Her words settle into me with a quiet certainty, shaping the moment into something steadier than vindication. She gestures to the room. They'll want a brief statement before we move forward. Nothing dramatic, just clarity. I step inside, finding several board members gathered around the table folders, open screens ready. Their eyes meet mine with something I haven't felt from them before: respect, without hesitation. One of them clears his throat. "Ms. Mercer," he says, "we owe you an apology. Your work sustained this company in ways we failed to recognize." I meet his gaze. "I didn't do it for recognition," I reply. "I did it because the structure mattered." Even so, he continues, "It's important that you know the integrity you upheld is the reason we can rebuild now." His sincerity feels real, not performative, not strategic, and I allow myself a quiet nod. The meeting moves quickly after that: discussions of restoring damaged systems, reestablishing accurate records, and setting safeguards to prevent anything like this from happening again. Through it all, I contribute calmly, methodically, the way I always have. When the decisions wrap, the board members file out, leaving only Janelle and me in the room. She leans against the table. "You didn't ask," she says, "but I know you're wondering what happens to him now." I let the question hang in the quiet. She answers anyway. "There will be an inquiry. His actions violated compliance, misled investors, and compromised the company's internal integrity. They'll pursue it." I nod once. "It's not about revenge," I say. "It's about accountability." "Exactly," she replies. "And you already delivered that." She gathers her things and pauses before leaving. "Dana," she says, "don't underestimate what you did here. You changed the trajectory of an entire organization." When she steps out, the room falls silent again. I look down at the table, running a hand over its smooth surface, as though measuring the distance between what used to be and what comes next. The elevator chimes in the hallway, and I head toward it, my steps steady. The doors slide open, reflecting a clean, undistorted version of me standing alone. I enter and press the lobby button. As the doors begin to close, the mirrored surface catches the light in a thin, vertical line, narrowing around my reflection until only my eyes remain visible. It strikes me then that truth doesn't just reveal others, it reveals who we become when everything else falls away. The elevator descends quiet and certain, carrying me toward a future no longer shaped by someone else's shadows. Mini hook. And the next chapter waits on my terms alone.